She has no claim to the ranch. Not a penny of the 85 million belongs to her. That was the first thing I heard when the cameras started flashing. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, stood at the podium, her chin high, her voice steady, and she erased me in front of the entire room. Reporters scribbled notes, neighbors shifted in their seats, and I felt my stomach drop like I had fallen through the floor. I sat frozen in the front row, the widow of Richard Hale, the man who built this ranch with me over 4 decades. My hands gripped the chair until my knuckles turned white. She had done it in public, with microphones catching every word, as if humiliation was just another line item in her plan. And then, from the side of the room, I heard a sound that cut through the tension. The lawyer seated behind her let out a short laugh he could not hide. That laugh told me something had cracked. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to shout. But my voice caught in my throat. The lights were too bright. The crowd too silent. Vanessa kept speaking, smooth and professional, as if she were announcing the launch of a business venture and not dismantling my life. She talked about efficiency, about modernization, about honoring Richard's vision. My name never passed her lips. It was as though I had never existed. I glanced around the hall. Photographers angled for the perfect shot. A group of ranchers from the county stood near the back, whispering among themselves. Some avoided my eyes, others looked at me with pity. I felt like an exhibit on display, a widow stripped of dignity before strangers who had once shaken Richard's hand at cattle auctions and harvest festivals. The ranch was not just numbers on a page, it was land Richard cleared with his own hands, barns we repaired through storms, herds we raised year after year. Every fence post had a story, every acre carried our sweat. Yet in a few sentences, Vanessa had declared it was all hers to control, and the reporters scribbled as if it were the simple truth. I sat straighter, forcing myself not to crumble under the weight of it. The lawyer's laugh replayed in my head. Why had he laughed? Did he know something she did not want revealed? For one flicker of a moment, I felt a pulse of hope. When the questions began, they all went to Vanessa. She smiled, polished, calm. She spoke of investment opportunities, of partnerships with development firms, of honoring community traditions. Every word carried the sheen of corporate language, hollow but impressive to those who did not know what home truly meant. I wanted to shout that this was not what Richard wanted, that he had promised me I would never have to worry. But I stayed still, my nails biting into my palms. When the press conference ended, the crowd began to disperse. Chairs scraped against the floor, the air filled with murmurs. Vanessa stepped aside to greet investors. No one approached me. No one asked me if I needed a ride back to the ranch. I stood alone, the widow, watching as the story of my life was rewritten without me. Outside, the winter sun was harsh against my eyes. Cameras flashed one last time before the reporters hurried to file their stories. The lawyer who had laughed brushed past me, carrying a stack of folders. For a brief second, our eyes met. He gave me the smallest shake of his head, as if to say, "Not everything is as it seems." Then he walked on, leaving me with more questions than answers. I walked to my car slowly, each step heavy with disbelief. My reflection in the glass of the driver's side door startled me. I looked older than I felt, smaller than I knew myself to be. I pressed my hand to the cold metal and told myself to breathe. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold before I touched it. The silence in the house was unbearable. Richard's boots still rested by the back door. His hat still hung on the hook where he left it the last time he came in from the fields. It was all too alive to accept that he was gone, and too empty now that his son's wife had declared me invisible. I thought about standing in that hall, About the cameras, the whispers, the lawyer's laugh. My name had not been spoken, but I was not erased. Not yet. Something in my gut told me the story Vanessa spun was not the whole truth. And as much as she wanted to bury me under polished words and legal documents, I was still here, still breathing, still holding the memory of a man who trusted me more than anyone. I whispered to the quiet kitchen, "I will not disappear." And even though no one was there to hear it, the words felt like the first step back into my own story. The morning after the press conference, I walked through the ranch house as if it already belonged to someone else. Vanessa had taken over every detail of Richard's funeral arrangements. From the flowers to the slideshow, nothing carried his warmth. It all looked like a staged production meant to impress her friends and colleagues. I barely recognized the life I had lived for more than 40 years. When people came to the house that afternoon, they went straight to Vanessa. She gave instructions about catering, told the staff where to place chairs, and answered questions about scheduling. I stood in the doorway, invisible in my own home. Old neighbors passed me with polite nods, but no one stopped to talk. It felt as if Vanessa had quietly positioned herself as the hostess while I had been pushed aside. Later that day, she walked through the kitchen holding a folder. She barely glanced at me before saying, "The service is set for Friday. The reception will be at the ranch hall. I already confirmed the vendors." Her voice was flat, efficient. She didn't ask for my thoughts. She didn't ask if I agreed. She simply announced it as though my opinion no longer mattered. I tried to keep my composure. "Richard always said he wanted something simple," I told her. "Nothing too polished." She gave me a thin smile. "People expect a certain standard. It reflects on the family." Then she walked out, leaving me standing by the counter with the weight of her words pressing down on me. That night I sat in Richard's study. The smell of his tobacco still lingered in the wood. His books were stacked just as he had left them, his notes scattered on the desk. I wanted to lose myself in the familiarity, but the thought of Vanessa making decisions as if she alone carried his legacy filled me with unease. She was not grieving, she was orchestrating. At the funeral, the pattern repeated. I arrived early, expecting to greet friends and relatives. Instead, I found Vanessa at the entrance, shaking hands and guiding guests to their seats. When I approached the front row, she hesitated for a split second before moving a program aside to make space for me. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, while she delivered a polished tribute to Richard that sounded more like a corporate speech than a farewell to the man I loved. People whispered that the service was beautiful. They admired the flowers, the music, the slideshow. But as I listened, I thought of Richard's words. He had always said funerals should be messy, that people should cry, share stories, laugh at bad jokes, and hold each other close. None of that happened. Instead, it felt like Vanessa had scripted every moment to project control. After the burial, guests returned to the hall for the reception. Conversations buzzed about future plans for the ranch. I overheard two men discussing potential partnerships and land development. One of them said, "Vanessa has everything in order. The transition will be smooth." The word transition made my chest tighten. There had been no transition. There had been erasure. When the last guests left, I found myself alone in the garden. Folding chairs sat empty, half-filled cups left on the tables. The scent of lilies hung heavy in the air. No one asked if I needed a ride home. Vanessa had already left with a group of investors. I stood in the fading light, my heart sinking deeper with every passing moment. The following week I tried to go about my routines. I walked through the barns, fed the hens, checked the fences. The ranch still carried Richard's presence, but the silence was louder than ever. Workers nodded politely, yet waited for Vanessa's orders, not mine. I was a ghost drifting through the place I had once helped build. One afternoon, while I was folding laundry, Vanessa appeared in the doorway. She handed me a small box with Richard's name on it. "He asked me to give you this," she said, her tone neutral. Inside was a silver tie clip, one Richard rarely wore. There was no letter, no note, no explanation. That was all. "Thank you," I whispered, though my throat ached. She nodded and left. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway until the house fell silent again. I stared at the tie clip in my palm. Richard had written me notes all through our life. Even when he was sick, he scribbled small lines on paper to remind me of his love. The idea that his last message to me would be a tie clip, without a word, felt wrong. It felt arranged. That night I could not sleep. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that turned cold as the hours passed. The house felt unfamiliar. Every corner carried Richard's memory, yet it was as though my name had been erased from the walls. Vanessa had stepped into his absence and filled it with her own design. I tried to tell myself it was grief that made her act this way. I tried to excuse her distance as shock, but when I remembered the firmness in her voice at the press conference, the calculated way she managed every detail of the funeral, and the hollow gesture of the tie clip, I knew this was something else. It was not grief. It was control. And while I sat at that table staring into the darkness, one thought kept circling in my mind. If Richard had truly asked her to give me that box, then where were the letters? Where was his voice? Where was the promise he had made that I would be cared for? The silence had no answers, but it left me with a determination I had not felt before. Vanessa had declared her power in front of the world. She had silenced me in my own home. But I was still breathing, still here, and the story of the ranch was not finished yet. I woke before sunrise the next morning, my chest heavy with the memory of that tie clip. The house was silent except for the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. I brewed coffee but let it sit untouched on the counter. I knew the truth deep down. Whatever Richard had meant for me, it was not this. He would never have left me with nothing but silence. Vanessa sent me an email later that day. The subject line read, "Estate Administration." The message was short, clinical, with a scheduled time for a meeting downtown at her firm. There was no greeting, no hope you are doing well, just a date and an address. I stared at the screen for a long time. She had turned my life into an appointment on her calendar. On Wednesday morning, I put on a plain coat and drove into town. Traffic crawled, and twice I almost turned around. My hands shook on the steering wheel. By the time I reached the building, I was 5 minutes late. The glass tower rose against the winter sky, sleek and cold. Inside, the air smelled of eucalyptus and printer ink. The receptionist barely glanced at me before leading me to a conference room. The door closed with a soft click. Around the long table sat 7 people in dark suits. Vanessa sat at the head, her hair pulled back tight, eyes fixed on a stack of folders. She did not stand. She did not greet me. She only nodded toward an empty chair at the far end. I took my seat. The silence felt deliberate, as if they had rehearsed how to make me small. Vanessa cleared her throat and began to read. "As executor of the estate, I will be walking us through the distribution of assets." Her voice was sharp and practiced, the same tone she had used at the press conference. She listed holdings as though she were reading an inventory, stock portfolios, 2 commercial properties in Salem, partial ownership of a winery. Then she announced that 6 months before Richard's passing, he had transferred primary control of the family trust to her. My hands tightened in my lap. I had managed that trust with him for 2 decades. He never mentioned transferring anything. The others around the table nodded, scribbling notes. My name was not mentioned. When one associate finally asked about my share, Vanessa looked up briefly and said, "There are no remaining distributions assigned to her under the current filing." Just like that. The words echoed in my ears. No remaining distributions. My chest burned, but I kept my hands folded, my face calm. No one looked at me. No one questioned the statement. They carried on as if I were not even in the room. When the meeting ended, I waited as the others gathered their papers and left. Vanessa packed her briefcase slowly. She seemed to expect me to speak, but I said nothing. I stood, adjusted my scarf, and walked out. The cold air outside struck my face like a slap. I did not cry. I did not let myself feel broken. Instead, a strange stillness settled over me. If I opened my mouth then, it would have been to shout. Instead, I saved the words for myself. At home, I sat in the dark study. Richard's cane leaned against the back door where he had left it after his last trip to the hospital. His handwriting was still on the wall calendar. Every detail reminded me of the promises he had made to me, promises now erased by Vanessa's voice in that polished room. I thought about what she had done. She had spoken over me, and no one questioned it. She had declared her authority, and no one doubted it. But authority does not erase truth. That night, I pulled out a notebook of my own. I wrote down everything I remembered from the meeting. The words she used, the timing, the faces of the witnesses. My handwriting shook, but the lines were clear. I told myself that if she had rewritten Richard's story, then I would write my own. I did not shout. I did not beg. Instead, I made a quiet promise. I would not accept this as the end. The next morning, I opened the desk drawer in Richard's study without knowing why. The drawer squeaked as it always had. Inside were envelopes, receipts, pencils, old notes. At the back, beneath a ledger, I found a thin folder I did not recognize. My heart thudded as I pulled it out. The folder held 3 pages. On top was a note in Richard's handwriting. His words were shaky, but unmistakable. He wrote that Vanessa had pressed him to update the will. He had not signed anything yet. He had doubts. He had not told me because he feared my questions. I pressed the page against my chest. For the first time since his death, I felt him speaking to me. I read the other pages. One was a draft of a will that still included me, my name circled in red pen with notes in the margins. Another was a typed schedule of legal appointments during the months he was in treatment. Meetings he had never mentioned to me. The truth was here, in my hands. He had resisted her pressure. He had left behind traces that could not be erased. I slid the folder back into the drawer, my mind racing. I did not know what to do yet. I did not have a plan. But I knew one thing with certainty. Vanessa had declared her control. She had spoken as though I was gone. But Richard had not abandoned me. He had left behind his doubts, his warnings, his unfinished words. And those words would be my beginning. A week after the meeting downtown, I drove past the southern pasture and saw a sign hammered into the ground. For sale. I pulled over and sat staring at it through the windshield. My chest tightened. That land had been part of the ranch since Richard's grandfather. I stepped out and walked toward the fence, the winter wind cutting through my coat. A group of men stood near the boundary line, pointing and talking numbers. Vanessa was with them, her heels sinking into the dirt, her hand waving toward the open fields, as if she were giving a tour of something she already owned. I did not go closer. I turned back to the truck, my boots sinking in the mud, my hands shaking. By the time I reached home, the sign felt burned into my mind. That evening the phone rang. A neighbor's voice said, "I hear Vanessa is selling off 10 million worth of the ranch. Is that true?" I could not answer. The silence on my end told him everything. That night, I sat in the living room with the lights off. The only sound was the ticking of the clock. For the first time, I felt the walls closing in. Every corner of the house carried Richard's memory, but each hour, Vanessa's control grew stronger. The workers at the barn now looked to her for direction. The accountant called her number, not mine. Even family friends spoke of her decisions as if they were final. A few days later, she appeared at the ranch hall with a group of investors. I watched from the doorway as she stood at the head of the table, presenting charts and schedules. Her voice carried through the room. She spoke about maximizing efficiency, about liquidating sections of land to modernize the operation. None of the men questioned her. They nodded, smiling, already counting their share. I wanted to shout that she was dismantling Richard's life's work, but my throat closed tight. After they left, she walked into the kitchen where I sat with a cup of tea. "We closed on the southern pasture today," she said without looking at me. "It was necessary for the growth plan." I stared into my cup. Richard never wanted the land split. She paused, her eyes flat. "Richard is gone. I am making sure the ranch survives." Then she walked out, her heels tapping against the hardwood until the sound disappeared. I gripped the cup until it nearly broke in my hand. The room swayed, the air heavy with the smell of dust and coffee. I thought of the folder hidden in Richard's desk, his doubts, his handwriting, proof that he had not trusted the changes she pushed. But what good was proof when she stood in front of the world and claimed the ranch as her own? That evening, I drove into town for groceries. At the checkout counter, I heard two women whispering. "Vanessa is remarkable," one said. "Imagine running an 85 million ranch on her own." The other nodded. "Poor Margaret. She looks so lost." I walked out before they noticed me. The cold air stung my eyes. I loaded the groceries slowly, my hands numb, and drove home in silence. The following weekend, Vanessa hosted a reception at the ranch hall. She invited local officials, business leaders, and the press. I was told about it only through a printed invitation slid under my door. It listed my name at the bottom as a guest, not as the woman who had lived and worked here for decades. When I arrived, the hall was filled with music, polished wood floors, tables lined with catered dishes. Vanessa stood in the center of the room in a tailored dress, her smile flawless. She greeted everyone with a firm handshake, a practiced tilt of her head. She looked like the face of a new empire, not a grieving daughter-in-law. I stayed near the back, unnoticed. I watched as she unveiled a plan for expansion, complete with glossy brochures. Reporters scribbled, cameras clicked, guests applauded. She raised a glass of champagne and spoke of vision, of future generations, of stewardship. The word love never crossed her lips. When the applause ended, I slipped out into the night air. The sky was dark and clear, the stars sharp against the cold. My breath clouded in front of me as I walked toward the barn. The doors creaked open and I stood inside, surrounded by the smell of hay and horses. This was Richard's world, not glossy brochures or polished speeches, just work, sweat, and earth. I placed my hand on the wooden post and closed my eyes. For a moment, I let the anger wash over me. She was dismantling everything he had built, and I was standing by like a stranger. I knew if I spoke too soon, without proof, I would be dismissed as bitter, as lost. But if I stayed silent too long, there would be nothing left to fight for. That night, I returned to the house and sat at Richard's desk. I opened the drawer and pulled out the folder again. His words stared back at me. He had not trusted her. He had felt something was wrong. I whispered into the empty room, "I see it too." The decision settled quietly inside me. I would not challenge her yet, but I would not allow her lies to be the last word. She thought I was powerless, a shadow she could erase. But I had the truth, and the truth would not stay hidden forever. One evening, the sky had already gone dark when I returned from the barn. I stepped into the study and felt a pull toward the old oak desk. Richard had spent countless nights there, his pencil scratching against paper, his glasses sliding down his nose. I had avoided opening the lower drawers since the day he passed, but that night I knelt down and pulled at the handle. Inside were envelopes, worn ledgers, and stacks of receipts. Tucked beneath a pile of magazines was the thin manila folder I had found before. I laid it out on the desk and opened it again, determined to see every word clearly. The first page was Richard's handwriting. His letters wavered, a little shaky, but his voice was in them. He had written, "Vanessa insists I change the will. She says clarity is important. I am uneasy. I have not signed anything yet. I have not told Margaret. She will ask questions I do not have the strength to answer." I read the lines again and again until they blurred. My throat tightened as I realized this was not just hesitation. It was a warning. Richard had sensed something but had chosen silence. The second page was a photocopy of a draft will. My name was there. It read, "I leave my personal assets, including home shares and designated accounts, to my wife, Margaret Hale." The words had been crossed out in thick pen. In the margin, scrawled beside it, was a note. "Discuss with Vanessa." The third page listed appointments with law firms and consultants. Some were dated during the months he was in treatment, times when I had sat by his bed for hours. He must have slipped away when Vanessa visited. My hands trembled as I realized how much had been hidden from me. I pressed my palm against the paper. For the first time since his death, I felt he was reaching back to me, trying to leave a trail. He had not abandoned me. He had fought quietly, leaving fragments of his struggle in this folder. I tucked the papers back and leaned against the chair. The room was silent except for the hum of the ceiling fan. I closed my eyes and remembered one of our last dinners together. He had told me, "You do not need to worry about anything, Ma. I have taken care of it." His hand had rested over mine. I had believed him. Now his words felt like a riddle. What had he meant by taken care of it? Had he trusted Vanessa to handle the details? Or had he tried, in his own way, to shield me until the end? The next morning, I carried the folder to the kitchen. I set it on the table beside my coffee and stared at it in the pale light. Part of me wanted to burn it, to pretend none of it existed, but another part knew it was the only proof that Richard had doubted her. I hid the folder in a lockbox in the hallway closet, the one where we kept passports and medical papers. Then I sat at the table with a clean notebook and began writing down everything. Dates, notes, the exact phrasing of Richard's lines, the appointments listed. My pen moved steadily, as if by writing it I could anchor myself to the truth. That afternoon I went for a walk through the fields. The winter grass crunched beneath my boots. I thought of Richard's hands planting trees at the edge of the property decades ago. He had told me then, "They will outlive us both." The trees still stood, their branches bare, waiting for spring. As I walked, I realized the folder was more than evidence. It was Richard's voice reaching through the silence Vanessa had built around me. Every note, every correction, every mark in the margins spoke louder than her polished speeches. Later that week, I returned to the study and searched further. In the back of another drawer, I found a leather-bound journal. It was filled with Richard's neat handwriting. Most pages were ordinary notes about livestock, expenses, and weather. But near the end, the lines grew uneven. He wrote about his illness, his fears, and one entry stopped me cold. Vanessa handles the details now. She says it is easier this way. I trust Margaret, but she worries too much. If I leave everything in her name, the burden will be heavy. Vanessa says she will protect both of us. I am not sure. I miss the days when it was only Margaret and me deciding together. The words blurred as I read them. He had trusted her, but only half. He had doubted her, but not enough to stop. He had left me in the shadows, thinking it was kindness. I closed the journal and held it to my chest. My heart ached with both love and anger. He had wanted to shield me, but in doing so, he had opened the door for her. That night I sat by the window with the journal and the folder stacked beside me. The moonlight spilled across the floor. I whispered into the stillness. You tried, Richard. You tried. But now it is my turn. I did not know yet how I would fight, but the decision was no longer in question. Vanessa had power, but I had his words. She believed she had erased me, but Richard had left me a map written in doubt and hesitation, and I would follow it. A few days after I found the journal, Vanessa sent another invitation to the house. It was a heavy cream card embossed with gold letters. The heading read, Gala for the Future of Hale Ranch. At the bottom, my name appeared in small print under the word Guest. I set it on the counter and stared at it until the letters blurred. She was hosting an event in Richard's name, parading herself as guardian of the ranch, while I was reduced to a name on a list. On Saturday evening, I dressed simply and drove to the ranch hall. The parking lot was already full. Bright lights spilled out of the tall windows, and music floated across the night air. Inside, polished floors gleamed, and floral centerpieces lined the tables. Photographers moved through the crowd, capturing Vanessa at every angle. She stood in the center of the room, her dress sleek, her smile perfect. Guests surrounded her like bees around a flower. I stayed near the back wall, watching. Her voice carried above the chatter as she welcomed donors, ranchers, and county officials. She spoke of legacy and innovation, of expanding into new markets, of modernizing operations. Each sentence dripped with confidence. Applause rose and cameras flashed. Not once did she acknowledge me. I drifted toward a display table labeled Richard's Favorite Things. I stopped short when I saw what she had arranged there. His old fountain pen, the one I gave him for our 20th anniversary. A signed baseball he had kept on his desk. Even the first edition novel I had given him one Christmas. Each item bore a card, crediting it to Vanessa's collection. My name was nowhere. I reached out and touched the corner of the book. Memories of Richard reading by the fire filled me, his laughter echoing through the room. My eyes stung, but I forced myself to stand still. This was not grief anymore. It was theft, disguised as tribute. A man approached, introducing himself as one of Richard's business partners. He asked casually how I was managing the estate. When I told him I had been removed before Richard passed, his face flickered with confusion. He recovered quickly, offering polite words before slipping back into the crowd. His reaction told me everything. Vanessa had not shared the full story. I left the hall soon after, the music still echoing behind me. In the car, I gripped the steering wheel and let the night settle around me. She was building a stage, painting herself as savior of the ranch, while quietly stripping me of any place in its history. The following week, I noticed changes on the ranch. Workers carried out orders that came directly from Vanessa. Trucks delivered equipment I had not approved. The barns filled with strangers, consultants she brought in to evaluate efficiency. When I asked one of the foremen about a shipment, he hesitated before saying, "Vanessa said it was necessary for restructuring." I walked back to the house, my chest tight. It was as if she was erasing me one command at a time. One afternoon, she appeared in the kitchen, clipboard in hand. "We will be liquidating a portion of the herd," she said matter of fact. "The revenue will stabilize cash flow." "Richard always said the herd was the heart of the ranch," I replied quietly. She looked at me, her eyes cool. "Richard is not here. I am making sure this place survives." She turned and left before I could answer. That night I went to the study again. I opened the lockbox and laid out the folder and journal. I read Richard's words until the ache in my chest grew too heavy. He had doubted her. He had feared what she might do. Yet here she was, doing exactly what he had worried about. I told myself I could not stay silent forever, but I also knew I had to move carefully. Vanessa was ruthless, but she was also calculated. If I rushed forward without preparation, she would crush me with legal words and polished speeches. The next morning I went into town for errands. At the cafe, I overheard two men at the counter praising Vanessa. "She knows what she's doing," one said. "That ranch will be more profitable than ever." The other nodded. Margaret must be relieved to have someone so capable in charge. I gripped my cup tighter, the coffee sloshing over the rim. I wanted to turn and tell them the truth. Instead, I walked out into the cold, my heart pounding. She had convinced the world she was the rightful heir. I was nothing more than a shadow. That evening I stood at the edge of the northern field, watching the sun dip behind the trees Richard had planted. The air smelled of earth and frost. I thought of the promises he made, of the love we had built into this land. My fingers brushed the notebook where I had copied his words. I whispered to the empty sky, "I will not let her rewrite this story." The silence pressed back, steady and unbroken. It was then I understood. Vanessa might control the stage for now, but Richard had left me a map. His doubts were my compass. His unfinished words were my strength. I turned toward the house, the resolve hardening in my chest. She believed I was powerless. But she was wrong. The morning after the gala, I sat at the kitchen table with Richard's folder and journal spread before me. The sunlight fell across the pages, making every line of his handwriting look heavier, more urgent. I knew I could not carry this burden alone. Vanessa had power, money, and a polished voice that convinced everyone around her. I had only fragments of Richard's doubts. If I wanted to protect what he built, I needed help. I thought of Samuel Ortiz, an old friend of Richard's and a lawyer we had trusted years ago. We had not spoken in a long time, but his number was still written in Richard's address book. My hands shook as I dialed. The phone rang twice before his calm voice answered. "Samuel, it's Margaret," I said quietly. There was a pause, then a softer tone. "It has been a long time. How are you holding up?" I swallowed hard. "Not well. I found something in Richard's things. Notes. Doubts about changes to the will. I do not know what to do." He was silent for a moment. "Meet me tomorrow morning. Bring everything you have." The next day, we met at a small cafe off Main Street. It was the same place where Richard used to meet Samuel after ranch auctions. Samuel looked older, his hair grayer, but his presence was steady. I slid the folder across the table. He read in silence, his brow tightening as he scanned Richard's handwriting and the crossed-out clauses in the will. When he finally looked up, his voice was firm. "This is not normal hesitation. These notes show clear pressure. If Vanessa filed a version that contradicts this draft, there may be grounds to challenge." I felt a flicker of hope, though fear pressed against it. She has everyone believing she is the rightful heir. I do not know how to fight her. You do not have to fight alone, he said. I know someone who specializes in contested estates. Her name is Helen Wu. I can bring her in, but only if you are ready. I nodded slowly. I am ready. 2 days later, I met Helen at Samuel's office. She was sharp, direct, and wasted no words. She spread out the documents I brought and examined them carefully. Handwritten notes from Richard doubting the process, crossed out clauses that once protected you, outside witnesses brought in at unusual times. This points to undue influence. The phrase hung in the air. Undue influence. It gave shape to what I had been feeling but could not name. Helen leaned forward. We will need to act carefully. Do not confront Vanessa directly. Keep collecting anything you find. Emails, drafts, receipts. The more we can document, the stronger the case becomes. I left that office with the folder tucked safely under my arm and a new weight in my chest. It was no longer just my grief. It was a responsibility. Richard had tried to warn me. Now it was my duty to bring his truth forward. At home, I searched every corner of the study. I opened drawers, flipped through calendars, sifted through boxes of old files. Each discovery was small, but together they built a picture. Appointment cards with firms Richard had never mentioned, invoices from notaries I did not recognize, notes in the margins of his journals, brief but telling. Vanessa says urgency. Cannot sign yet. I wrote everything down in my notebook, creating a timeline. Each entry was another step toward clarity. Meanwhile, Vanessa moved through the ranch with growing confidence. She arrived in new cars, escorted investors through the barns, held meetings with staff. I overheard her once on the phone saying, "We will finalize the restructuring by next quarter." Her voice was certain, dismissive, as if I were already erased. I stayed quiet, observing, recording. When workers asked me about changes, I nodded but said little. It was not time yet. One evening, I returned to the study and found Richard's leather calendar still sitting on the shelf. I had flipped through it before, but this time, I looked more closely. A Tuesday morning appointment was circled twice. Beside it, the name Travis Blake. My stomach tightened. I remembered the name faintly. He had been an accountant who worked with Richard years ago. I called Samuel immediately. Does the name Travis Blake mean anything to you? There was a pause. Yes. He handled some of the trust paperwork in the early years. Why? Richard circled his name before he passed. Twice. I will reach out, Samuel said. If he was involved recently, he may have seen something. That night I sat by the window with the calendar in my lap. The sky outside was black, the stars faint. I thought of Richard's last words to me about not worrying, about how he had taken care of everything. Perhaps this was what he meant. He had left me a path, scattered through notes, journals, and appointments. All I had to do was follow it. The next morning I woke with a sense of purpose I had not felt in months. Vanessa might have the stage, the investors, the polished speeches, but I had something she did not. I had Richard's voice, written in his own hand, whispering from the pages she could not erase. And now I had allies who were listening. The following week, Samuel called me early in the morning. His voice was calm but urgent. I have something for you. Can you meet me at the office today? I drove into town with the folder resting on the seat beside me. The streets were quiet, the air sharp with cold. When I stepped into the office, Samuel was waiting with Helen. A stack of documents lay on the table between them. Helen gestured for me to sit. We obtained a certified copy of the will filed with the county. I want you to see this. She slid the document toward me. My eyes moved over the typed lines. At first glance, it looked complete, official. But then I saw the section that had once held my name. The line was gone, erased cleanly. Helen placed another sheet beside it, a photocopy from Richard's draft. My name was there, my share detailed, circled in red ink. I pressed my hand against the table to steady myself. So he meant for me to be included. It was only later that it disappeared. Samuel nodded. This is the first real opening. Drafts like this show intent. If the final version contradicts Richard's earlier wishes, it gives us grounds to question the legitimacy. I leaned back in the chair, my chest tight. It was not yet victory, but it was proof that Richard had not abandoned me. His hand had written my name, his pen had circled it. Helen's voice was steady. We will need more. Witnesses, dates, any sign that Vanessa orchestrated the changes. But this document gives us something to hold on to. I carried copies of the papers home that evening. I laid them out on Richard's desk and stared at the red circle around my name. For months, I had felt erased. Now, here was evidence that he had tried to preserve me in his legacy. Later that week, I received another invitation from Vanessa. This time, it was for a private gathering at the country club, a tribute in Richard's name, with cocktails and an auction of what she called his treasured possessions. I recognized several items listed on the program. They had come from our home. I decided to attend, not to confront her, but to see. On Saturday night, I walked into the country club. The room glowed with chandeliers and polished wood floors. A large photo of Richard stood near the bar, the same tired picture Vanessa had used before. Guests mingled, glasses clinked, polite laughter filled the air. Vanessa stood at the center, elegant and composed, greeting each guest as if she were queen of the night. I moved quietly through the room until I reached the auction tables. My chest tightened when I saw what she had laid out. Richard's vintage pen, a watch I had given him on our anniversary, even a set of books he had kept by his bedside. Each item carried a label, part of Richard Hale's legacy, donated by Vanessa Hale. My name was nowhere. I stood there, my hand brushing the edge of the table, when an older man approached me. He introduced himself as a former colleague of Richard's. His voice was kind. It's good to see you. Tell me, how are you managing the trust these days? I stared at him, caught off guard. I'm not. Vanessa removed me before Richard passed. His brow furrowed. That doesn't sound right. Richard always said you were joint trustee. I nodded, unable to say more. He gave me a small, awkward smile and moved away. But his reaction told me Vanessa's version of the story was not complete. She had not told everyone the truth. I left the club early, my mind racing. She was rewriting Richard's history, but cracks were beginning to show. The next morning, I met Samuel and Helen again. I handed them my notes from the night. Helen tapped her pen against the page. This is useful. If she has been presenting herself as the sole heir to outsiders while concealing earlier drafts, it strengthens our case. What you saw and heard matters. Samuel leaned back. It is not time for open confrontation yet, but we are closer. The draft you hold proves intent. The reactions of Richard's colleagues show Vanessa has not been transparent. We must keep building. I drove home with a strange calmness settling over me. For months I had felt powerless, trapped in silence. But now, piece by piece, the truth was surfacing. That night I sat in the study again, the copies of Richard's draft spread before me. I traced the red circle around my name with my finger. He had tried to protect me. He had left his intent in ink. I whispered into the quiet. I will carry this forward. You are still with me. It was not a final victory, but it was the first light breaking through the darkness. A few mornings later, the phone rang as I was pouring coffee. It was Samuel. His tone was different this time, lighter but edged with urgency. Margaret, I think we found something. Do you remember the name Travis Blake? My breath caught. Yes, Richard circled his name in the calendar. Twice. Travis worked with the trust years ago. I contacted him. He agreed to meet. He says he remembers things that could be important. I set the mug down, the coffee sloshing over the rim. When? This afternoon. My office. Bring the folder. The hours crawled by as I waited. I pulled out the folder again, reread Richard's shaky handwriting, traced the red circles in the draft will. Every word felt heavier now, pointing me toward this meeting. By noon, I was in the car, the folder resting on the seat beside me like a passenger. Samuel's office was quiet when I arrived. Helen was already there, papers spread across the table. A few minutes later, the door opened and a man stepped in. Mid-40s, tall, his coat damp from the drizzle outside. He introduced himself as Travis Blake, his voice steady but guarded. He shook my hand and sat down. His eyes moved to the folder. I never thought I'd be back in this, he said quietly. Helen leaned forward. Tell us what you remember. Travis folded his hands. Richard came to me about 8 months before he passed. He looked tired, weaker than I'd ever seen him. He had questions about the trust. He said Vanessa wanted him to update the documents, but he seemed unsure. He asked me what protections existed for you, Margaret. He said he didn't want you left without support. My chest tightened. I gripped the edge of the table. And what did you tell him? I told him the structure you had in place already protected you. There was no need to rush changes unless he was certain. He seemed relieved. We talked about scheduling a review. He even set an appointment for the following week. Helen's pen tapped against the pad. But it never happened. Travis nodded. No. A week later, I got a call from Vanessa. She said Richard no longer needed my services. She was curt, almost dismissive. It struck me as odd. When I tried to follow up with Richard directly, she intercepted, said he was too ill and everything was handled. The room went still. My heart pounded in my ears. Travis continued. There's more. One evening I stayed late at the office. I went back for my jacket and saw Vanessa with another staffer in the conference room. They had a stack of papers on the table. She asked me to witness a signature. I assumed Richard was in the next room, but when I asked, she said he'd just stepped out. She insisted it was urgent. I signed, but I never saw him put pen to paper. That bothered me enough that I jotted a note in my planner. I still have it. He pulled a worn notebook from his coat and flipped it open. He pointed to a line dated months before Richard's death. In neat handwriting it read, 7:43 p.m., Sunday. Witnessed signature for R. No P present. Helen read it twice, her jaw tightening. This is significant. You're saying you witnessed a document where Richard wasn't present? Yes, Travis said quietly. At the time, I told myself it was a small irregularity. But after I heard he had passed and Vanessa announced sweeping changes, I couldn't shake it. Samuel leaned back, exhaling slowly. This is exactly what we needed. A first-hand account of questionable execution. Combined with Richard's own notes, this is powerful. I sat frozen, my eyes on the planner. The words blurred as tears welled. Richard had left me breadcrumbs, and now here was someone who had seen what I could not. Helen turned to me. Margaret, with this testimony, we can argue that the amendments were coerced or improperly executed. It's enough to request a formal hearing. I found my voice, low but steady. So this means he didn't willingly erase me? Travis looked at me, his expression gentle. From what I saw, he was hesitant. He wanted to protect you. Whatever happened after, it wasn't his intent. The weight on my chest eased slightly, replaced by a fiercer resolve. Richard had not betrayed me. He had been cornered, manipulated, silenced. But his truth had survived in notes, in drafts, in the memory of a man who still carried guilt for signing a line he hadn't witnessed properly. We sat in silence for a moment. The hum of the office heater filled the room. Finally, Helen spoke. The next step is filing a motion to challenge. We'll use the draft will, Richard's journal entries, and Travis's testimony. Vanessa will fight back, but this gives us leverage she cannot easily dismiss. I nodded. Do it. When I left the office that evening, the rain had stopped. The air smelled clean, sharp. I walked slowly to the car, the folder clutched against my chest. For months, I had felt like a shadow, erased from Richard's story. But now the truth had begun to speak louder than Vanessa's polished lies. Driving home, I replayed Travis's words in my head. He wanted to protect you. That was what mattered most. Richard's intent had not been lost, only buried, and now it was rising to the surface. At the ranch, the house was quiet, the fields dark under the night sky. I set the folder back in the desk, but this time it did not feel like a burden. It felt like a weapon. I whispered into the stillness, "We are not done, Richard. I will finish what you started." 2 weeks later, the first hearing was set. It was short, only meant to establish the grounds for inquiry, but it was enough to open the door. Helen prepared every document, each note from Richard, every page Travis had provided. Samuel sat with me at the long oak table outside the courtroom, his hand steady on the file. I could hear the shuffle of papers and the low hum of voices behind the door. When the judge entered and the session began, my breath slowed. Helen spoke clearly, outlining Richard's drafts, the irregular witnesses, and Travis's note that no signature had been seen. Vanessa's lawyer countered with polished confidence, claiming grief had clouded my judgment, that I was inventing doubts because I had been left out. The judge listened, then ruled that the case could proceed. A freeze was placed on all ranch assets until the matter was resolved. The words struck like thunder. Freeze. Vanessa would not be able to sell or transfer anything until the court finished its review. For the first time in months, I felt the weight tilt away from me. News spread quickly. Articles appeared in the local paper, small at first, but loud enough to reach the community. Neighbors stopped me in the market, whispering their support. "I always wondered how she stepped in so fast," one woman said. Another man told me, "Richard trusted you. Everyone knew it." Their voices carried more than comfort. They carried doubt, and doubt was the one thing Vanessa could not control. At the ranch, the change was almost immediate. Workers who once followed her orders without question now hesitated. Investors grew quiet. Meetings cancelled. I overheard one consultant telling another, "We'll wait until the court decides." Her stage was slipping. Vanessa stormed into the house one evening, her heels sharp against the floor. She stood in the doorway of the study, eyes blazing. "You think freezing the ranch helps anyone? Do you know what this does to our reputation?" I looked at her calmly. "Richard wanted me protected. I am only making sure of it." Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing more. She turned on her heel and left, the slam of the door echoing through the hall. A week later, Helen received copies of Vanessa's internal emails through Discovery. She called me into the office and laid them on the table. The subject line read, Revised structure, immediate actions. In the body, Vanessa had written, remove co-beneficiary privileges per our discussion. I stared at the line, my heart pounding. That was my erasure reduced to a single sentence. Helen's eyes were sharp. This shows intent. She was not following Richard's wishes. She was instructing her team to strip your name from the documents. I felt both fury and clarity. The truth was no longer hidden in whispers or drafts. It was written in her own words. The board of the foundation soon heard of the freeze and the pending inquiry. At their next meeting, murmurs spread. A colleague of Richard's reached out to me quietly. He said, "We are concerned about how she has represented herself. Some of us want to pause any transition until this is resolved." It was not an apology, but it was recognition that I still existed in the story. That night, I sat on the porch, listening to the wind move through the bare trees. For months, the silence had pressed against me, making me feel invisible. Now the silence carried something else. It carried the sound of Vanessa's control unraveling. The following week, Vanessa hosted another event, this time with fewer guests. Photographers still circled, but the applause was thinner. I stood in the back again, unnoticed, watching her force a smile. She spoke of vision and growth, but her voice lacked the same shine. People listened politely, but no longer with the same trust. When I returned home, Samuel called. "The board is requesting a third-party review of the documents. That's a serious shift. They are not standing behind her the way they once did." I nodded into the phone, though he could not see me. It was only a matter of time. Days later, another article appeared in the paper. This one carried more weight. It quoted an unnamed source who said there were inconsistencies in the will and pending allegations of undue influence. Vanessa's photograph ran alongside the words. For the first time, the public saw her not as savior of the ranch, but as a figure under suspicion. I went to bed that night and slept longer than I had in months. Still, I knew it was not over. Power does not vanish quietly. Vanessa would strike back. Sure enough, within days, a letter arrived from her attorney. It accused me of interfering with a lawful estate, of acting out of bitterness, of attempting to damage her reputation. They threatened to pursue legal costs if I did not withdraw the motion. I read the letter 3 times before folding it neatly and setting it beside the lamp. Then I picked up the phone and called Samuel. "They want me to surrender," I said. His voice was steady. "Do you want to?" "No," I answered. My voice was quiet but certain. "I have already surrendered enough." He chuckled softly. "Then we push forward." The next morning, Helen filed a rebuttal. She attached every piece of evidence we had gathered. Richard's draft with my name circled, his journal entries, Travis's planner with the Sunday notation, Vanessa's email removing my privileges. Together the pages told a story that was stronger than her polished speeches. By evening, word had spread. The ranch phone rang with calls from reporters. I let it go unanswered. I had no need to defend myself to strangers. The documents spoke for me. I walked to the back field at sunset. The sky glowed orange over the horizon, the cattle grazing quietly in the fading light. I thought of Richard, of his promise that I would not have to worry. He had not foreseen everything, but he had left me enough to find my way. The world now knew that Vanessa's control was not built on truth. It was built on manipulation, and the cracks had spread wide enough for everyone to see. The notice arrived on a Thursday. The foundation board would meet the following week to finalize the transfer of executive authority. The letter was polite, formal, written as though everything had already been decided. At the bottom, my name appeared only as a courtesy, listed as a guest. I placed the letter on the kitchen table. and stared at it until the light outside faded. I knew what it meant. Vanessa wanted me to watch her settle into the chair Richard once held, to see her crowned in front of the same people who had turned their eyes from me. For a moment I felt the old ache return, but then I thought of Richard's red ink circling my name, of Travis's testimony, of the judge's freeze on the ranch. I folded the letter, slipped it into my bag, and told myself I would go. Not to watch her, but to remind them that the truth had not been buried. On the day of the meeting, I dressed carefully. A simple navy blouse, slacks, and the thin silver chain Richard had given me on our 35th anniversary. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just steady. I arrived 5 minutes early and walked through the glass doors of the new office building. The marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. A receptionist led me to the conference room. Inside, the board members were already seated. Some I recognized from years past, men and women who had shared dinners at our house, who had toasted to Richard's speeches. Others were newer faces, younger, sharper, watching me with polite detachment. At the head of the table sat Vanessa. Her suit was dark blue, her hair pulled back in a perfect knot. She looked composed, every movement measured. When she saw me, her smile flickered for just a moment before returning to its polished curve. She gestured toward an empty chair at the far end of the table. I took my seat quietly, folding my hands in my lap. The meeting began with pleasantries, notes about donations, updates on programs, upcoming events. I listened in silence, the hum of voices washing over me. Then the chairman shifted the agenda to the item marked Transition of Executive Oversight. Vanessa cleared her throat and rose slightly in her chair. Her voice carried across the room, smooth and confident. She thanked the board for their trust, spoke of Richard's vision, and promised continuity. Her words were rehearsed, each phrase polished. She paused for effect, then said, "It is with your grace that I carry this forward." The words hit me like ice. Your grace. As if I had handed her the role, as if I had bowed in consent. My chest tightened, but I did not move. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a plain envelope. I slid it to the man seated beside me, one of Richard's oldest friends still on the board. He looked at me with confusion, then opened the envelope. Inside was a copy of Travis's deposition, Richard's draft will with my name circled in red, and a summary prepared by Helen. His eyes scanned the pages. His expression changed from confusion to something heavier. He passed the envelope to the next member without a word. One by one, the papers travelled around the table. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded. Vanessa's voice faltered as she noticed the shift in the room. Her smile tightened, her hands stilled on the table. The confidence in her tone thinned. By the time the last member finished reading, the room had fallen silent. I rose slowly from my chair. "Thank you for allowing me to attend," I said quietly. "My attorney will be available if anyone here requires clarification." I gathered my bag and walked toward the door. Not hurried, not angry, just steady. The silence followed me out of the room, broken only by the faint rustle of papers. Outside, the air felt sharper, clearer. I stepped into the hallway and let the door close behind me. For the first time in months, I felt taller. I had not shouted, I had not pleaded. I had simply placed the truth where it could not be ignored. Later that evening, Helen called. Her voice was measured, but I could hear the shift beneath it. One of the board members already reached out. They want a separate internal review before any transfer moves forward. You did exactly what was needed. I sat by the window as she spoke, the night pressing against the glass. My heart was steady. It was Richard's truth, I told her. All I did was carry it into the room. In the days that followed, whispers spread through the community. The vote was postponed. Vanessa's lawyer fell silent. Articles appeared hinting at fractures within the foundation. For the first time since Richard's death, the story no longer belonged solely to her. Doubt had taken root. At the ranch, the workers noticed too. They greeted me differently, with cautious respect, as though they were beginning to remember who I was. The land looked the same. The cattle moved through the pastures. The wind carried the same sharp scent of winter. But everything felt altered. The balance had shifted. One evening, I walked to the far field where Richard had planted the line of oaks. Their branches stood bare against the fading light, waiting for spring. I rested my hand on the rough bark and let the silence hold me. I thought of the room earlier that week, of Vanessa's face when the envelope moved around the table, of the weight that settled when the last page was read. I whispered softly, "We are still here, Richard. They finally heard you." The wind moved through the trees, and for the first time in a long while, I felt peace. A month after the board meeting, the silence around the ranch felt different. There were no more late-night phone calls from attorneys, no more invitations with Vanessa's name embossed in gold. Instead, there were small shifts that spoke louder than words. The board announced they would place the foundation under a temporary oversight committee until the court concluded its review. Investors withdrew quietly. The gala invitations stopped. Vanessa's image no longer filled the papers. One morning, Helen arrived at the house with a folder. She set it on the kitchen table and spoke plainly. "Vanessa is withdrawing as managing executor. Her attorneys filed the notice this morning. She is framing it as an effort to preserve Richard's legacy, but the truth is clear. She knows the evidence will not hold." I listened without speaking, my hands resting on the wood grain of the table. Relief did not come in a rush. It settled slowly, like a heavy coat being lifted from my shoulders. After months of silence and erasure, the fight had ended not with spectacle, but with resignation. The following week, the Foundation released a statement naming an interim committee made up of Richard's oldest colleagues. Their language was simple. They spoke of preserving his vision and ensuring stability. My name was not printed, but I no longer needed it to be. I knew the truth of what we had built, and now the people who mattered knew it too. Vanessa came to the ranch one afternoon to collect the last of her belongings. I found her in the study, standing by Richard's desk. Her posture was stiff, her face pale. For the first time, she did not look polished or prepared. She looked tired. She glanced at me. "You won. Are you satisfied?" I studied her carefully. This was never about winning. It was about protecting what Richard left behind. Her eyes flickered with something I could not name. Anger, maybe, but also weariness. She closed the drawer and stepped back. I thought I was doing what he wanted. I thought control was the only way to keep everything from falling apart. I nodded slowly. Maybe you believed that. But control without honesty is only destruction. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air was heavy, with all that had been lost between us. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the door. Before leaving, she turned once more. "I hope you find peace here. I never did." The sound of the door closing echoed through the hall. I stood in the silence for a long time, my hand resting on the desk where Richard had written his last words. It struck me then that Vanessa, for all her ambition, had been grieving too. She had filled her loss with control, while I had filled mine with silence. Both of us had been wrong in different ways. In the weeks that followed, the ranch settled back into rhythm. Workers returned to their tasks with steadier steps. The herd grazed in the fields as they always had. The air carried the same scent of hay and soil. Yet everything felt new. There was space again for memory, for love, for Richard's presence to linger without being overshadowed. I began sorting through boxes in the study, letters, journals, photographs. I set aside what should be archived, what should be preserved for the community. One evening I discovered a sealed envelope tucked behind a ledger. Inside was an earlier will Richard had written, one that named me as co-trustee for life. In his own hand he had written, "No matter what changes, I want Margaret to stand beside me." I held the paper against my chest and closed my eyes. The words were not for the court or the board. They were for me, and they were enough. Spring arrived slowly that year. The daffodils in the community garden bloomed first, bright yellow against the thawing ground. I walked along the path and remembered Richard planting the oaks decades ago. Their branches now stretched tall and wide, proof that life endures beyond storms. I was invited to a small luncheon at the foundation months later. The new committee welcomed me warmly. They asked about Richard's early vision, about the programs we had started together. I offered what I could, not as a figure to be honoured, but as a witness. When they applauded, I only nodded. The recognition was quiet, but it was enough. That night I walked home through town. I passed the old bookstore where Richard used to stop every Sunday. In the window was his favourite novel, displayed as if waiting for him. I smiled and kept walking. Back at the ranch, I brewed tea and stepped onto the porch. The air was cool, the sky wide and open. The land stretched before me, steady and alive. For the first time since his passing, I felt not like a shadow, but like the woman who had built a life with him. I whispered into the night, "We did it, Richard. We are still here." If you have ever faced a moment where you felt erased, I want you to remember this story. It is proof that silence is not surrender, and that truth has a way of finding light, even when others try to bury it. Sometimes victory is not loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is the quiet return of dignity, the steady reminder that what is built with love cannot be stolen by lies. If this story touched you, share your own moments of resilience in the comments. You are not alone, and your voice matters.